Imagine owning your home for over 40 years. You raised your children there. You buried your husband from that front porch. And then one morning, a woman in a lanyard and a golf cart shows up and tells you that you need to leave. This is that story. Margaret Ellison had lived in the same white craftsman house on Dellwood Drive for 43 years. She had moved in as a young bride, painted the shutters herself, planted rose bushes along the front walkway, and watched the entire neighborhood grow up around her. She had seen empty lots become family homes. She had attended more block parties, graduation celebrations, and neighborhood cookouts than she could count. Dellwood Drive was not just her address. It was her identity. For most of those 43 years, the neighborhood had no formal homeowners association. People just looked out for each other. Lawns got mowed. Fences got painted. Disputes got settled over coffee. It was the kind of neighborhood that people wrote nostalgic essays about. Then came the Pinnacle Ridge HOA. About 7 years before this story begins, a developer had purchased the land at the far end of Dellwood Drive and built a cluster of 18 new construction homes. Modern, boxy, all sharp angles and gray paint. The kind of houses that look like they were designed by someone who had never actually lived in one. The developer had formed an HOA to govern his new builds, and through a series of annexation moves that most longtime residents didn't fully understand until it was too late, the Pinnacle Ridge HOA had extended its reach to cover the entire street, including the older homes that had been there for decades. Margaret had received the paperwork. She had read it slowly, with her late husband Harold's reading glasses perched on her nose, and she had signed where they told her to sign because a neighbor she trusted had said it was just a formality, just a little administrative thing, nothing to worry about. That was the first mistake, but it wouldn't be hers for long. For the first few years, the HOA was mostly invisible to Margaret. She received the quarterly newsletter. She paid the modest annual dues without complaint. She attended exactly one HOA meeting, found it insufferably boring, and never went back. Life went on. Then Diane Forsythe became HOA board president. Diane had moved into one of the new construction homes 4 years ago with her husband and 2 golden retrievers. She was the kind of woman who color-coded her recycling bins and had very strong opinions about the correct height for mailbox posts. She had run for HOA board president unopposed because nobody else wanted the job, and she had taken the position with the energy of someone who had finally found their true calling. Within 6 months of Diane's presidency, the HOA had tripled its number of violation notices, introduced a new 8-page architectural guidelines document, and launched what Diane called a neighborhood beautification initiative. What it actually was, as longtime residents quickly discovered, was a systematic campaign to pressure the owners of the older, more modest homes into either expensive renovations or outright sale. Margaret's house was at the top of Diane's list. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret found it tucked under her windshield wiper on her car in the driveway. It cited her rose bushes as being in violation of the HOA's landscaping standards, specifically a clause that required all front yard plantings to be maintained at a height of no more than 18 inches. Margaret's roses, which she had been tending since before Diane Forsythe was born, stood at approximately 22 inches. Margaret trimmed the roses. She measured them with a tape measure. She took a photograph with the date and time visible. She sent a polite written response to the HOA acknowledging the notice and documenting her correction. 2 weeks later, a second notice arrived. This one-sided peeling paint on the south-facing window trim. Margaret squinted at the window in question. There was, she eventually found, a small patch of paint no larger than a playing card that had begun to chip at the corner. She hired a painter. She sent another written response with photographs and a copy of the invoice. 3 weeks after that, a third notice arrived, then a fourth, then a fifth. The violations became increasingly petty and increasingly difficult to substantiate. A barely visible crack in the front walkway. A garden hose she had left coiled on the side of the house. A solar-powered lantern that Diane claimed violated the HOA's outdoor lighting ordinance. An ordinance that Margaret could not find anywhere in the official documents she had been given. Margaret was 71 years old. She lived alone. She was on a fixed income. And she was spending money she didn't have to correct violations that barely existed, issued by a woman she had never once had a real conversation with. But the notices were only the beginning. At the HOA's annual general meeting, a meeting Margaret made a point of attending that year, Diane stood up in front of the assembled homeowners with a printed presentation and announced that several properties on Dellwood Drive were, in her words, materially impacting the long-term property values of the community. She did not name Margaret directly. She didn't have to. The photograph she had included in slide 4 of her presentation was an aerial image of Dellwood Drive with 3 houses circled in red. Margaret's craftsman was front and center. Diane proposed a new HOA policy, a formal aesthetic compliance program that would require any home not meeting updated architectural standards to either complete a full exterior renovation within 18 months or face escalating fines of up to $500 per month. The motion passed 7-4. Margaret sat very still in her folding chair and said nothing. Around her, she could hear murmuring, a few sympathetic looks from neighbors she had known for decades. But nobody spoke up. Nobody pushed back. The meeting moved on. Margaret drove home that night, sat in her kitchen under the same overhead light she had cooked 1,000 dinners under, and allowed herself exactly 15 minutes to feel afraid. She was a 71-year-old widow with a modest savings account and a house that was, by any fair measure, perfectly well maintained. And a woman she barely knew had just put a target on her back. After 15 minutes, Margaret got up, went to her home office, and began to write. She wrote down every violation notice she had received, with the date, the claimed violation, and the action she had taken in response. She wrote down the dates of every HOA communication she had received going back 3 years. She wrote down what she remembered from the meeting, word for word, as accurately as she could. She wrote down the names of the people who had voted yes and the names of the people who had voted no. Then she went to her bookshelf, pulled out the HOA agreement she had signed years ago, and began to read it. Not the way she had read it the first time, skimming and trusting, but slowly, carefully, the way her late husband Harold used to read contracts, underlining and folding page corners and making notes in the margins. What Margaret found over the course of that long night would change everything. The HOA's own founding documents contained a clause, buried on page 31, in a section titled Governance and Fair Practice, that explicitly prohibited the board from enacting policies that disproportionately targeted homeowners based on the age or original construction date of their property. There was also a clause that limited fine escalation to a maximum of $200 per month without a full membership vote, not just a board vote. The $500 figure Diane had announced was not just aggressive. It was a direct violation of the HOA's own rules. Margaret put her pen down. She looked at the clock. It was nearly 2 in the morning. She picked up her pen again and wrote one more name at the bottom of her notepad. Not Diane's. Not the HOA's. She wrote the name of an attorney. By the time the sun came up over Dellwood Drive and the light fell through Margaret's kitchen window the way it had for 43 years, she had a plan. And the Pinnacle Ridge HOA, though they didn't know it yet, had made the worst mistake of their very short, very self-important existence. The attorney's name was Patricia Owens, and she came recommended by Margaret's neighbor Frank, who had used her years ago in a boundary dispute that Frank had won so thoroughly his neighbor had moved away entirely. Patricia was in her mid-50s, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the kind of calm, unhurried energy that Margaret found immediately reassuring. She listened without interrupting as Margaret laid out every document, every photograph, every violation notice, and every note she had taken over the past several months. She read the HOA's founding documents with the same slow, deliberate attention that Margaret had. And when she finally looked up, she did not look surprised. She looked interested. Patricia explained several things to Margaret that afternoon that Margaret had not previously known. The first was that the HOA's beautification initiative, as it had been voted on and structured, almost certainly violated both the HOA's internal governance documents and a state-level statute governing common interest communities, specifically the provision that prohibited discriminatory enforcement against properties based on age or construction era, a protection that existed precisely to prevent newer HOA boards from targeting older homes. The second thing Patricia explained was that the pattern of violation notices Margaret had received, the escalating frequency, the increasingly minor infractions, the timing relative to the new policy, presented what lawyers called a course of conduct, a documented pattern that could support a claim of targeted harassment. The third thing, and the one that made Margaret set down her coffee cup, was that the HOA had been collecting fines and fees under the new escalated structure for at least 3 months without the proper membership vote required by their own charter. That money, Patricia said quietly, had been collected unlawfully. Margaret asked what that meant in practical terms. Patricia told her. It meant they had a case. A serious one. The letter that Patricia sent to the Pinnacle Ridge HOA board on Margaret's behalf was 7 pages long. It outlined each legal violation in precise, numbered detail. It cited the relevant state statutes by code. It included copies of every violation notice, every payment receipt, every photograph Margaret had taken, and a formal demand that all enforcement action against Margaret's property cease immediately, that all unlawfully collected fines be returned with interest, and that the HOA board provide a full accounting of the reserve fund within 30 days. The letter also included, on the final page, a notice of intent to file suit if the demands were not met within 2 weeks. Diane Forsythe received that letter on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, she had called an emergency board meeting. By Friday afternoon, the HOA had retained its own attorney, a move that cost them $4,000 from the reserve fund just to get the man on the phone. The HOA's attorney advised the board to settle quietly and quickly. He used words like exposure and liability and advised against further escalation. Diane did not take this advice well. She had not become HOA board president to back down from a 71-year-old woman with rose bushes. She directed the board to reject Margaret's demands and fight. That was the second worst decision the Pinnacle Ridge HOA ever made. The first had been targeting Margaret in the first place. Patricia filed suit within 48 hours. The complaint was comprehensive and methodical. It alleged discriminatory enforcement under the state's Common Interest Community Act, breach of the HOA's own governing documents, unlawful collection of fines, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. A claim supported by a documented pattern of notices, the public presentation that had displayed Margaret's home on a slideshow, and several written communications from HOA board members that Patricia described, with considerable understatement, as aggressively worded. What happened next was the kind of legal unraveling that people who work in HOA law tell stories about for years. During the discovery process, the phase where both sides are required to share documents and information, Patricia's requests revealed something that nobody, not even some members of the HOA board itself, had been fully aware of. The HOA's reserve fund, which was supposed to hold approximately $60,000 collected from homeowners over the years for maintenance and common area expenses, had been significantly depleted, not through legitimate expenses, but through a series of payments to vendors and contractors that, under scrutiny, looked very irregular. Several of the vendors could not be verified. Several of the invoices were duplicates. One payment of nearly $8,000 had been made to a landscaping company that turned out to be registered at the same address as a relative of a board member. Margaret had filed suit over her rose bushes. She had uncovered what appeared to be a significant pattern of financial mismanagement, and possibly worse. Patricia brought in a forensic accountant. The accountant spent 3 weeks reviewing the HOA's financial records. Her report was 42 pages long and contained findings that Patricia described to Margaret on a quiet Tuesday afternoon as extraordinary, in the way that word is sometimes used to mean deeply and thoroughly damning. The case that had begun as a single homeowner defending her property against an overreaching HOA board had grown into something far larger. 2 other homeowners, both of them older residents who had been receiving violation notices and quietly paying fines for years, contacted Patricia after hearing about the lawsuit and asked to be included. The suit was amended to a class action. The HOA's attorney, who had been fighting the case aggressively for months on Diane's insistence, finally put enough pressure on the board to make them understand what was at stake. The financial irregularities alone represented potential personal liability for board members. The discrimination claims, if proven at trial, carried statutory damages. The legal fees were mounting faster than the reserve fund, what remained of it, could absorb. 3 days before the scheduled trial date, the HOA's attorney called Patricia with a settlement offer. Margaret and Patricia reviewed it at the kitchen table in Margaret's craftsman house, the same table where Margaret had spent that long night making notes by lamplight months before. The offer was substantial. It included a full refund of every fine and fee ever collected from Margaret and the 2 other plaintiffs under the disputed enforcement actions, with interest. It included a formal written acknowledgement that the HOA's beautification initiative had been improperly enacted and was void. It included a commitment to a full third-party financial audit of the HOA's accounts, the results of which would be shared with all homeowners. And it included a sum, a significant one, drawn from whatever remained in the reserve fund and supplemented by personal liability insurance carried by 2 of the board members, paid directly to Margaret and the other plaintiffs as settlement damages. Diane Forsythe resigned from the HOA board the same day the settlement was signed. She and her husband listed their house on Dellwood Drive for sale 3 weeks later. Margaret did not watch them move out. She was in her backyard, on her knees in the dirt, planting a new row of roses along the south fence line. They were a deep, old-fashioned red, the kind her mother had grown and her grandmother before that. The kind that bloomed every spring without being asked, without following anyone's guidelines, without checking whether they met the required 18-inch height restriction. They did not. They never had. They never would. The neighborhood was quieter now. The golf cart had stopped making its rounds. The violation notices had stopped arriving. The folding chairs at HOA meetings sat mostly empty, which suited most of the longtime residents of Dellwood Drive just fine. Margaret washed the soil from her hands at the garden hose on the side of the house, the same hose that had once been cited as a violation, and stood for a moment looking at her home. The white Craftsman with the painted shutters. The front porch where she had spent 43 years watching the street go by. The house that had been declared outdated, a drag on property values, a problem to be solved. It was still standing. She was still standing. And somewhere in a file folder in Patricia Owens' office, there was a signed settlement document that said, in clear legal language, that this house and this woman had never been the problem at all. Margaret never missed another HOA meeting, and she brought a notepad every single time. If you think she was right to fight back, smash that like button. Drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Subscribe for a new story every week. You won't want to miss what's coming next.